nomination. That'll be at 1 p.m. Eastern. A vote on that nomination is scheduled for 2. And now live Senate coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. Today's opening prayer will be offered by Father Bass, National Executive Director of Boys Town in Boys Town, Nebraska.
Creator God, we ask your blessing upon the men and women of the United States Senate. Give them the wisdom of Father Edward Flanagan, the founder of Boys Town, who taught America that there are no bad boys, only bad environment, bad training, and bad example. Help us as a nation to save children by healing families, so that they can provide the good environment, training, and example our young people need to be healthy, productive citizens. Please inspire our senators to work together to strengthen our families and communities so that our children can become stronger in body, mind, and spirit. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 12, 2011. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Mark Begich, a senator from the state of Alaska, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Senator Nebraska.
Mr. President, I would like to rise today to thank Father Stephen Bays for delivering the opening prayer this morning. Father Bays has been a priest of the Archdiocese of Omaha since 1985. He has more than 20 years' experience as a counselor and youth advocate in Nebraska. Father Bays served 8 years as director of the St. Augustine Indian Mission and School in Winnebago, Nebraska. He established programs to help Winnebago and Omaha children preserve their traditional language, spirituality, and culture while preparing them for higher education. In 2005, Father Bays was named the executive director of Boys Town, one of the largest child care organizations in America. Boys Town provides compassionate, research-proven treatment for children with behavioral, emotional, and physical problems. Father Bays is the fourth priest to succeed Father Edward Flanagan, the founder of Boys Town. As a young priest in Omaha, Father Flanagan had grown discouraged in his work with transient men. His frustration led him to borrow $90 to rent a drafty downtown boarding house and open his first home for boys in 1917. Youngsters from all over Omaha soon began showing up at the doorstep of Father Flanagan's home for boys. When the idea of a boys' home grew in my mind, I never thought anything remarkable about taking in all of the races and all of the creeds, Father Flanagan said. To me, they're all God's children. They are my brothers. They are children of God. I must protect them to the best of my ability. In 1921, Father Flanagan moved his boys' home to a farm just outside of Omaha, and it soon became known as the village of Boys Town. By the 1930s, hundreds of boys lived there. The world learned of Father Flanagan's success in 1938 when he was played by Spencer Tracy in the Boys Town Hollywood movie. Boys Town began admitting girls in 1979 and established programs at more than 12 sites across the country in the mid-1980s. Under the leadership of Father Bays, Boys Town is focused on implementing its unique integrated continuum of care to strengthen a child's mind, body, and spirit. Father Bays is also expanding Boys Town's role in advocating for changes to our child care system, which is often fragmented, expensive, and ineffective. He has called for smarter investments in earlier interventions for at-risk children, which can prevent much more expensive problems for society if those children fall through the cracks. For instance, keeping a 14-year-old from dropping out of high school will end up saving taxpayers about $500,000 over that child's lifetime. Keeping him from becoming a career criminal will save as much as $5 million. Almost a century ago, Father Flanagan said, quote, "There is nothing the matter with our growing boys that love, proper training, and guidance will not remedy," close quote. Father Bays continues to carry out that vision of healing today. I thank Father Bays, I know we all do, for his devotion to building healthy, positive lives for children. And I thank Father Bays for his words of prayer this morning. May they indeed guide us to do what is right for America and the world. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Appreciate the comments of my friend from Nebraska, senior senator from Nebraska. Following any leader remarks, the Senate will be on morning business till 1 p.m. today. Republicans will control the first 30 minutes. The majority will control the next 30 minutes. Following morning business, the Senate will be in executive session to consider the nomination of Michael Francis Urbanski, the United States District Judge for the Western District of Virginia. There will be 1 hour of debate on that. So at approximately 2 p.m., there will be a roll call vote on confirmation of the Urbanski amendment. I'm also told that S-953 is the desk and due for a second reading.
Clerk will report.
S-953, a bill to authorize the conduct of certain lease sales in the Outer Continental Shelf and so forth, and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I object to any further proceedings with respect to this bill.
Objection is heard. It will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, as I speak, the heads of the 5 largest oil and gas companies in the world are testifying across the street. With the country watching, these extremely wealthy CEOs of extremely profitable corporations are trying to explain to the Senate, and most importantly to the American people, why they still need taxpayer handouts. I don't envy them, because it's an impossible position to defend. Think about this. In just the first 3 months of this year, the oil industry made $36 billion in profits alone. Not revenues, profits. That's $12 billion a month. That's $3 billion a week. In anyone's book, that's pretty good money. Meanwhile, the American taxpayer is giving these same successful companies $4 billion a year. So when you take these companies' profits and add in the handout you, me, and every taxpayer gives them, America is saying to big oil, you make $3 billion a week for 52 weeks, and we'll basically give you the 53rd week for free. Even in the strongest of economies, that seems unnecessary. In this recovering economy, it's downright indefensible. Basically, these tax breaks is such a hard thing to do that the big oil bosses, trying to defend them is such a hard thing to do, Mr. President, that they've called for backup. Most of our Republican colleagues have eagerly answered the call, publicly, already. But there's something I learned in the courtroom a long, long time ago. When you try to defend the indefensible, you're left with not much of a case. That's why the Republican defenders of big oil have resorted to simply making things up. They'll tell you that without this taxpayer-funded bonus, gas prices will go up. They say that because they know it's a scary thought. Gas prices are already high. But there's a big problem with their argument. It's false. It's not true. Big oil subsidies don't have a thing to do with the prices at the pump. A report released yesterday by the nonpartisan independent agency says as much. Experts at the Congressional Research Service who wrote this report don't mention it just once They write it over and over and over again. Here's one way CRS says it. Quote, there is little reason to believe that the price of oil or gasoline consumers face will increase, end of quote. Here's another, and I quote, available output and prices should be unaffected, end of quote. And here's one more. Taking away big oil's tax breaks, this independent, nonpartisan expert report says will have, quote, no effect on the price of gasoline. I repeat, no effect on the price of gasoline. Little reason to believe prices will increase, prices should be unaffected, no effect on the price of gasoline. Their words, not mine. So the American people should know this. Every time you hear someone defend taxpayer gifts to gas companies, oil companies, by scaring you about gas prices, they're not telling the truth. And every time you hear someone say that we need to find better uses for taxpayer money, but that we also need to keep giving billions and billions of dollars of that same money to oil companies, ask yourself how it's possible that both are true. I'm pleased to see that some of my Republican colleagues are coming around. Speaker of the House recently said these companies should be paying their fair share. Yesterday, the senior senator from Arizona admitted that subsidies are likely unnecessary. Even the former head of Shell, one of the 5 companies testifying today, agrees. If we're serious about reducing the deficit, this is an easy place to start. It's in effect a no-brainer, Mr. President. Taxpayer giveaways to companies pulling in record profits are the epitome of wasteful spending. So this is Democrats' idea. Let's use the savings from these taxpayer giveaways to drive down the deficit, not drive up oil company profits. There are no gimmicks in this legislation. It simply says, let's apply this money to the deficit. These CEOs and their companies are free to make as much money as they ethically can. That's the way it should be in our great country. They just don't need the taxpayer of our country help. They don't need our help. And the country could sure use those extra $4 billion a year. It's such an obvious solution that it should have happened years ago. But here we are, with one side saying that black is black, and the other side still insisting that black is blue. This debate would be a lot easier if Republicans just came out and said what they really mean. They should simply say openly that they want to protect their friends in big oil. I don't agree with it, but that's their right. Instead, they're peddling misinformation and scare tactics. Republicans should at least have the decency to admit it, and then let the American people decide who is best representing their interests.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
Anyone who cares about the future of our country should pay attention to the debate we're having right now in Washington. The outcome of this debate will determine whether America goes the way of debt-ridden countries in Europe, where unemployment is permanently high and expectations are permanently low, or whether we reclaim our role as a place where people are rewarded for hard work and for taking risks. This debate is important for other reasons, too. Last month, one of the major ratings agencies gave the U.S. a negative outlook. It said that because of our debt, we stand a 1 in 3 chance of being downgraded. The consequences of that would be truly devastating, and so would the impact on our ability to govern. If we allow it to happen, we'll be admitting America can't solve its problems, and I won't accept that. The fact that we have a crisis is not in doubt. Right now, America is taking in about $2.2 trillion each year in tax revenues, and each year we're spending about $2.2 trillion on mandatory spending and net interest on our debt. Now, what that means, Mr. President, is that all of the other spending, every single discretionary dollar we spend right now on roads, schools, defense, food safety, environmental protection, all of it, every single penny, is borrowed money. We don't have a dime to spend above and beyond the dimes that we have to spend by law. If that's not a fiscal crisis, I don't know what is. The Democrat solution to this crisis is simple. Just raise the debt limit so we can maintain the status quo. In fact, the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors said in a speech yesterday that it would be, quote, quite insane to do anything about the deficit while increasing the debt ceiling. That, the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors yesterday. The problem with that is that it isn't a solution. It's the avoidance of a solution. And that's not what the American people want. The American people spoke loud and clear in November. They want to see changes around here. Washington is mortgaging their future and their children's future by spending too much. They didn't speak out last November because they expected Republicans to come here and raise taxes. They sent Republicans here to get our fiscal house in order, and that's just what we intend to do. Americans are still outraged that Washington didn't do something to prevent the last financial crisis, a crisis most people didn't see coming. Failing to prevent one that every one of us knows is coming is, of course, totally inexcusable. So my message has been clear. Failing to do something about the debt would be far worse in the long run than failing to raise the debt limit. And that's why I'm repeating my plea to the Democrats this morning. The time to avert this crisis is right now. The window is closing. We cannot raise the debt ceiling as the President has requested without major spending cuts now. Some have suggested that we use triggers. Well, Mr. President, the triggers have already been pulled. What good is a fire alarm that goes off after the building burns down? Agreeing to a trigger is to deny this crisis. We need to face this problem now, not tomorrow, not after the President leaves office, not after the markets collapse, not after hell breaks loose, not after we lose another 3 million jobs and the housing market collapses again. Now, right now. Anything less would be a dereliction of duty and a signal to the world that America doesn't have the will to fix its problems. Republicans refuse to accept that. That's my message all along. That's a message we'll be taking down to the White House later this morning. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for debate until 1 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the first hour equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first 30 minutes and the majority controlling the next 30 minutes.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
I ask unanimous consent to be recognized for the duration of my remarks.
Without objection.
The successful end of the 10-year manhunt to bring Osama bin Laden to justice has appropriately heightened the nation's appreciation for the diligence, patriotism, and courage of our armed forces and our intelligence community. They're a great credit and inspiration to the country that has asked so much of them, and like all Americans, I'm in their debt. But their success has also reignited debate over whether the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques of enemy prisoners, including waterboarding, were instrumental in locating bin Laden, and whether they are necessary and justifiable means for securing valuable information that might help prevent future terrorist attacks against us and our allies, and lead to the capture or killing of those who would perpetrate them. Or are they, and should they be prohibited by our conscience and laws as torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment? I believe some of these practices, especially waterboarding, which is a mock execution, and thus, to me, indisputably torture, are and should be prohibited in a nation that is exceptional in its defense and advocacy of human rights. I believe they are a violation of the Detainee Treatment Act of 2005, the Military Commissions Act of 2006, and Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, all of which forbid cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of all captured combatants, whether they wear the uniform of a country or are essentially stateless. I opposed waterboarding and similar so-called enhanced interrogation techniques before Osama bin Laden was brought to justice, and I oppose them now. I do not believe they are necessary to our success in our war against terrorists, as the advocates of these techniques claim they are. Even more importantly, I believe that if America uses torture, it could someday result in the torture of American combatants. Yeah, I know that al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations don't share our scruples about the treatment of enemy combatants, and have and will continue to subject American soldiers and anyone they capture to the cruelest treatment imaginable. But we must bear in mind the likelihood that someday we will be involved in a more conventional war against a state and not a terrorist movement or insurgency. And be careful that we do not set a standard that another country could use to justify their mistreatment of our prisoners. And lastly, it's difficult to overstate the damage that any practice of torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment by Americans does to our national character and historical reputation, to our standing as an exceptional nation among the countries of the world. It is too grave to justify the use of these interrogation techniques. America has made its progress in the world not only by avidly pursuing our geopolitical interests, but persuading and inspiring other nations to embrace the political values that distinguish us. As I've said many times before and still maintain, this is not about the terrorists. It's about us. I understand the reasons that govern the decision to approve these interrogation methods, and I know that those who approved them and those who employed them in the interrogation of captured terrorists were admirably dedicated to protecting the American people from harm. I know they were determined to keep faith with the victims of terrorism and to prove to our enemies that the United States would pursue justice tirelessly, relentlessly, and successfully, no matter how long it took. I know their responsibilities were grave and urgent, and the strain of their duty was considerable. I admire their dedication and love of country, but I dispute that it was right to use these methods, which I do not believe were in the best interests of justice to our security or the ideals that define us and which we have sacrificed much to defend. I don't believe anyone should be prosecuted for having used these techniques in the past, and I agree that the administration should state definitively that no one will be. As one of the authors of the Military Commissions Act, which I believe prohibits waterboarding and other enhanced interrogation techniques, we wrote into the language of the law that no one who used them before the enactment of the law should be prosecuted. And I don't think it's helpful or wise to revisit that policy. Many advocates of these techniques have asserted their use on terrorists in our custody, particularly Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, revealed the trail to bin Laden, a trail which had gone cold in recent years but would now lead to his destruction. The former Attorney General of the United States, Michael McCarthy, recently claimed, and I quote, "The intelligence that led to bin Laden began with a disclosure from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who broke like a dam under the pressure of harsh interrogation techniques that included waterboarding. He loosed a torrent of information, including eventually the nickname of a trusted courier of bin Laden." That is false. With so much misinformation being fed into such an essential public debate as this one, I asked the Director of Central Intelligence, Leon Panetta, for the facts, and I received the following information. The trail to bin Laden did not begin with a disclosure from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was waterboarded 183 times. We did not first learn from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed the real name of bin Laden's courier or his alias, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, the man who ultimately enabled us to find bin Laden. The first mention of the name Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, as well as a description of him as an important member of al-Qaeda, came from a detainee in another country. The United States did not conduct this detainee's interrogation, nor did we render him to that country for the purpose of interrogation. We did not learn Abu Ahmed's real name or alias as a result of waterboarding or any enhanced interrogation technique used on a detainee in U.S. custody. None of the three detainees who were waterboarded provided Abu Ahmed's real name, his whereabouts, or an accurate description of his role in al-Qaeda. In fact, not only did the use of enhanced interrogation techniques on colleague Sheikh Mohammed did not provide us with key leads on bin Laden's courier, Abu Ahmed, it actually produced false and misleading information. Colleague Sheikh Mohammed specifically told his interrogators that Abu Ahmed had moved to Peshawar, got married, and ceased his role as an al-Qaeda facilitator, which was not true, as we now know. All we learned about Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti through the use of waterboarding and other enhanced interrogation techniques against colleague Sheikh Mohammed was the confirmation of the already known fact that the courier existed and used an alias. I've sought further information from the staff of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and they confirmed for me that, in fact, the best intelligence gained from a CIA detainee, information describing Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti's real role in al-Qaeda and his true relationship to Osama bin Laden, was obtained through standard, non-coercive means, not through any enhanced interrogation technique. In short, it was not torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of detainees that got us the major leads that ultimately enabled our intelligence community to find Osama bin Laden. I hope former Attorney General McCasey will correct his misstatement. It's important that he do so, because we are again engaged in this important debate, with much at stake for America's security and reputation. Each side should make its own case, but do so without making up its own facts. For my part, I would oppose any legislation, if any should be proposed, that is intended to authorize the administration to return to the use of waterboarding or other methods of interrogation that I sincerely believe are torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading, and as such unworthy and injurious to our country. This debate is ongoing, but I don't believe it will lead to a change in current policy prohibiting these methods. So perhaps this is just a debate for the history books, but it is still important because Americans in a future age, as well as their leaders, might face these same questions. We should do our best to provide them a record of our debates and decisions that is notable, not just for its passion, but for its deliberativeness and for opinions that were informed by facts, informed with scrupulous care by both sides for the security of the American people and the success of the ideals we cherish. We have a duty to leave future American generations with a history that will offer them not confusion but instruction as they face their crises and challenges and try to lead America safely and honorably through them. Both sides can't be right, of course, but both sides can be honest, diligent, and sincere. Let me briefly elaborate my reasons for opposing the return to these interrogation policies. Obviously, to defeat our enemies, we need intelligence, but intelligence that is reliable. We should not torture or treat inhumanely terrorists we have captured. I believe the abuse of prisoners harms, not helps, our war effort. In my personal experience, the abuse of prisoners sometimes produces good intelligence, but often produces bad intelligence. Because under torture, a person will say anything he thinks his captors want to hear, whether it is true or false, if he believes it will relieve his suffering. Often information provided to stop the torture is deliberately misleading. And what the advocates of cruel and harsh interrogation techniques can never prove is that we could not have gathered the same intelligence through other more humane means, as a review of the facts provides solid reason to be confident that we can. The cost of assuming otherwise can be hugely detrimental. It has been reported, and the staff of the Senate Intelligence Committee confirms for me, that a man named Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, who had been captured by the United States and rendered to Egypt, where we believe he was tortured, provided false and misleading information about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction programs. That false information was ultimately included, and I assume helped to influence the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq. Furthermore, I think it's supremely unfair to the men and women in our intelligence community and military who labored for a decade to locate Osama bin Laden to claim falsely that they only succeeded because we used torture to extract actionable intelligence from a few detainees several years ago. I have not found evidence to suggest that torture, or since so much of our disagreement is definitional, interrogation methods that I believe are torture, which I believe are prohibited by U.S. law and international treaty obligations, we are not just a party to, but leading advocates of, played an important part in finding and killing bin Laden. Rather, I think his death at the hands of the United States argues quite the contrary, that we can succeed without resort to these methods. It's also the case that the mistreatment of enemy prisoners endangers our own troops who might someday be held captive. While some enemies in al-Qaeda surely will never be bound by the principle of reciprocity, we should have concern for those Americans captured by more conventional enemies, if not in this war, then in the next. Until about 1970, North Vietnam ignored its obligations not to mistreat the Americans they held prisoner, claiming that we were engaged in an unlawful war against them and thus not entitled to the protections of the Geneva Conventions. But when their abuses became widely known and incited unfavorable international attention, they subsequently decreased their mistreatment of our POWs. Some have argued that if it is right to kill bin Laden, then it should also be right to torture him had he been captured rather than killed. I disagree. First, the Americans who killed bin Laden were on a military mission against the leader of a terrorist organization with which we are at war. It was not a law enforcement operation or primarily an intelligence operation. They could not be certain that bin Laden, even though he was unarmed, did not possess some means of harming them, a suicide vest, for instance, and they were correctly instructed to take no unnecessary chances in the completion of their mission. Second, bin Laden was a mass murderer. Had we captured him, he would have eventually received the ultimate sanctions for his terrible crimes, as captured war criminals in previous wars have. But war criminals captured, tried, and executed in World War II, for instance, were not tortured in advance of their execution, either in retaliation for their crimes or to elicit information that might have helped us locate, apprehend, and convict other war criminals. This was not done because civilized nations have long made a distinction between killing and injuring in the heat of combat on the one hand and the deliberate infliction of physical torture on an incapacitated fighter on the other. This distinction is recognized not only in long-standing American values and practices, but also in the Geneva Conventions that provide legal protections for our own fighting men and women. All of these arguments have the force of right, but ultimately, even they are beside the most important point. There are many arguments to be made against torture on practical grounds. As I have said, I believe torture produces unreliable information, hinders our fight against global terrorism, and harms our national interest and reputation. But ultimately, this debate is about far more than technical or practical issues. It's about far more than whether torture works or does not work. It is about far more than utilitarian matters. Ultimately, this is about morality. What is at stake here is the very idea of America, the America whose values have inspired the world and instilled in the hearts of its citizens the certainty that no matter how hard we fight, no matter how dangerous our adversary, in the course of vanquishing our enemies, we do not compromise our deepest values. We are America, and we hold ourselves to a higher standard. That's what's really at stake. Though Osama bin Laden is dead, America remains at war, and to prevail in this war, we need more than victories on the battlefield. This is a war of ideas as well, a struggle to advance freedom in the face of terror in places where oppressive rule has bred the malevolence that feeds an ideology of violent extremism. Prisoner abuses exact a terrible toll on us in this war of ideas. They inevitably become public, and when they do, they threaten our moral standard and expose us to false but widely disseminated charges that democracies are no more inherently idealistic and moral than other regimes. I understand that Islamic extremists who resort to terror would destroy us utterly if they could obtain the weapons to do so. But to defeat them utterly, we must also prevail in our defense of the universal values that ultimately have the greatest power to eradicate this evil ideology. Though it took a decade to find him, there's one consolation for bin Laden's 10-year evasion of justice. He lived long enough to see what some are calling the Arab Spring, the complete repudiation of bin Laden's worldview and the cruel disregard for innocent life and human dignity he used to advance it. In Egypt and Tunisia, Arabs successfully reclaimed their rights from autocracies to determine their own destiny without resort to violence or the deliberate destruction of innocent life. And now Arabs are trying valiantly, by means as just as their cause, to do the same in Syria and elsewhere. As the United States discusses and debates what role we should play to influence the course of the Arab Spring, can we not all agree that the first and most obvious thing we can do is stand as an example of just government and equal justice under the law, as a champion of the idea that an individual's human rights are superior to the will of the majority or the wishes of the government? Individuals might forfeit their life and liberty as punishment for breaking laws, but even then, as recognized in our Constitution's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, they are still entitled to respect for their basic human dignity, even if they have denied that respect to others. I don't mourn the loss of any terrorist's life, nor do I care if in the course of serving their malevolent cause they suffer great harm. They've earned their terrible punishment in this life and the next. What I do mourn is what we lose when by official policy or official neglect we allow, confuse, or encourage those who fight this war for us to forget that best sense of ourselves, which is our greatest strength, that when we fight to defend our security, we also fight for an idea, not a tribe, not a land, not a king, not a twisted interpretation of an ancient religion, but for an idea that all men are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. It is indispensable to our success in this war that those we ask to fight it know that in the discharge of their dangerous responsibilities to our country, they are never expected to forget that they are Americans and the valiant defenders of a sacred idea of how nations should be governed and conduct their relations with others, even our enemies. And those of us who have given them this onerous duty are obliged by our history and the many terrible sacrifices that have been made in our defense to make clear to them that they need not risk our country's honor to prevail, that they are always, through the violence, chaos, and heartache of war, through deprivation and cruelty and loss, that they are always, always Americans, and different, stronger, and better than those who would destroy us. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The leader is recognized.
Mr. President, in 1982, I was elected to the United States House of Representatives. I was elected along with the now senior senator from the state of Arizona, John McCain. We were both part of that class in 1982. Mr. President, I've given a lot of speeches on this Senate floor. So has my friend from Arizona, and so have all of us. But frankly, most of the speeches we give may have a little bite for a day or two. But the speech just given by my friend, senior senator from Arizona, will be forever remembered in our country and in this body. Senator McCain and I have had our differences over the years. That doesn't take away from the fact that we're friends. We love price fighting. And we love our states that are neighbors, Arizona and Nevada. He has an admirable record representing his party and running for the presidency of the United States, chairman of a number of committees here during his tenure in the Senate. We came to the Senate together in addition to the House of Representatives. I want the record today to reflect my admiration and respect, as I believe the whole Senate respects the speech given by this fine man from Arizona. No one in the Senate, no one, without any qualification, could have given the speech that was given today. Why? Because he speaks with knowledge, personal knowledge that I'm sure he still remembers in those dark nights when he's trying to rest, about his having been tortured. Here's a man who, after having been tortured brutally, solitary confinement, not for a week or a month, but years, was given permission by North Koreans to go home. We'll let you go home. He said, I'm not going home unless I go home with my colleagues who are in prison with me. Think about that. In a concentration camp, basically. So I wish I had the ability to express in words my admiration for what he's just said, because the things we do when it comes to our evil enemy, to say that all holes are barred doesn't work. The easy thing to do would be say that we should treat them as poorly as they treat us. But it takes a resume and courage to stand, as my friend from Arizona did today, and speak.
And could I just thank my very, very honorable friend and adversary for his kind remarks. I will always remember them. I thank you.
Mr. President, I will end my remarks here today by reading 3 paragraphs from an op-ed that's running all over the country today, in newspapers all over America. An op-ed written by Senator John McCain. And I quote, "As we debate how the United States can best influence the course of the Arab Spring, can't we all agree that the most obvious thing we can do is to stand as an example of a nation that holds an individual's human rights as superior to the will of the majority and the wishes of government? Individuals might forfeit their life as punishment for breaking laws, but even then, as recognized in our Constitution's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, they are still entitled to respect for their basic human dignity, even if they've denied that respect to others. All of these arguments have the force of right, but they are beside the most important point. Ultimately, this is more than a utilitarian debate. This is a moral debate. It's about who we are. I don't mourn the loss of any terrorist life. What I do mourn is what we lose when, by official policy or official neglect, we confuse or encourage those who fight this war for us to forget the best sense of ourselves. Through the violence, chaos, and heartache of war, through deprivation and cruelty and loss, we're always Americans, and different, stronger, and better than those who would destroy us.
Senator from Rhode Island is recognized.
Mr. President, I want to proceed in morning business, but before that, let me associate myself with the remarks from the Senator of Nevada, paying tribute to the senior senator from Arizona. Senator McCain's words were both eloquent and profound, and they reflect not only his strong beliefs, but his own personal experience, and they also reflect something else that has been consistent in everything that he has done in the Senate, and that is his respect and deep regard for the men and women of the military services. And his reflections today remind us of what they've done and also remind us of the high standards of conduct that they expect of themselves and that we have to recognize also. And, Mr. President, again, let me join Senator Reid in saluting Senator McCain for not only his words today, but for, as he does in so many times, being, in effect, the conscience of the Senate on so many important topics. Mr. President, I would also like today to support and talk about the provisions that my colleagues have introduced to ensure that the large oil companies of this nation who are receiving great tax subsidies contributed to deficit reduction, which is one of the great tasks before us. We're seeing extraordinary run-up in gas prices. In Rhode Island, it's touching or exceeding $4 a gallon. These high gas prices threaten our economic recovery, and they also put a brake on the expansion and job growth so necessary for all of our citizens. In fact, it's been estimated that because of these extraordinary gas prices, U.S. households will pay about $825 a year more in 2011 for gasoline than previously. That's a big, big bite out of the discretionary spending available to moderate income families across this country. One aspect of this run-up in prices is speculation. I'm so pleased that the President responded to a letter that I participated in suggesting the appointment of a task force to look into this. He has gone ahead and created the Oil and Gas Price Fraud Working Group under the leadership of Eric Holder, and they're looking seriously at the speculative aspects of the run-up in gas prices. There are some economists that estimate that this speculation could drive up prices by as much as $1 a gallon. In fact, the huge retreat last week from the commodities market for gasoline suggests that much more than simple supply and demand is responsible for these huge price increases, and we have to look carefully and clearly at this. But I'm also pleased to be a co-sponsor, along with Senator Menendez, of the Close Big Oil Tax Loopholes Act. It is extraordinarily ironic, and that's a mild term, to see the oil industry receiving huge subsidies at a time when market prices are producing what you would think would be the major incentive an oil and gas company needs to explore and to develop. And that incentive is rather substantial prices at the pump and throughout the nation. In fact, these prices have transformed and turned themselves into huge profits for the industry. ExxonMobil, for example, it posted its biggest first-quarter profit increase in 8 years, with net income rising 69% to $10.7 billion. In fact, the combined profits of the big five oil companies were more than $30 billion for the third quarter. Those are the kind of rewards in the marketplace which would suggest very strongly to everyone that the need for subsidies from the government is non-existent. Indeed, what we've seen, rather than using these subsidies to go out and these excess profits to go out and intensify the search for new oil, is that most of this is going to either providing dividends or stock buybacks to their stockholders. Now, that's a legitimate use of corporate money, but once again, it really undercuts this notion that these subsidies are so essential for the companies to be competitive. They're certainly highly competitive, and also necessary for the kind of activity they're undertaking to search for, develop new oil resources. Now, there are so many aspects of the bill that I think are positive, and they've been in part or in whole debated before. The bill ends a deduction the oil industry receives for the production of oil that was meant to assist American manufacturers, not oil producers, but American manufacturers. And in fact, there's some that suggest that the companies themselves, the oil companies, only discovered this tax loophole after the fact, but exploited it very aggressively. That it was intended for small companies that are producing physical products that can be shipped around the country, not bringing oil in, reprocessing it in refinery and selling it and getting a tax break. And there are so many other irrational aspects of these subsidies that, again, the subsidies themselves, I think, call for a serious review, evaluation, and indeed elimination. But the other factor that compels us to take these steps today is the simple factor is that we have to begin to reduce the deficit. All of the resources that are being raised, we hope, through this legislation, will be targeted to deficit reduction. It's a way in which I think we can continue, obviously, to provide the kind of necessary support for our economy through a healthy oil and gas system, but not to subsidize an industry that does well in the marketplace, and also to use those funds to reduce our deficit. There's another aspect, I think, and this is not directly related to the provisions that Senator Menendez and I support, but, for example, we have tried to get the oil and gas industry to at least pay more for the inspections that are so necessary on these offshore platforms to provide the safety, to prevent another deep water explosion. The administration has proposed an increase in fees oil companies pay for deep water rig inspections from the present fee of $3,200, $3,250 to be precise, to $17,000. And the companies have balked at this. Now, here's an industry that is deriving huge tax subsidies that obviously, the example of deep water, has raised serious concerns about their ability to manage and to develop some of these offshore platforms, and are essentially saying, no, we're not going to pay for more, for the inspection fees that are necessary. And the total increase is minimal. In fact, let me just give it a comparison. BP, British Petroleum, would be asked to pay about $1.5 million in fees if this new fee structure went into effect for their offshore platforms. That would represent about 0.01% of their revenues in the Gulf of Mexico alone last year. And yet the companies are saying no. When it comes to sort of paying their fair share for inspections that actually directly benefit them, provide further confidence to the public that their operations are successful, and gives them, frankly, more confidence in allowing or encouraging further offshore drilling, they say no. But when it comes to tax subsidies that benefit their bottom line, they say yes, yes, yes. And so I think, Mr. President, what we have to do is press forward on our efforts to ensure that these tax subsidies are revoked, dedicate these tax subsidies to deficit reduction, and in that way we can let the market decide on the success or failure of these companies. That's one of the mantras that I hear so often from many here, particularly my colleagues on the other side. And I think it can be done without in any way impacting the cost of fuel in the United States. Because I think, frankly, what we're seeing, going back to my initial point, is that there are factors beyond tax subsidies that are driving up the cost of fuel. Speculation, issues of the international exchange, the value of the dollar. But it's quite clear, given our dependency, and we have to get off that dependency on oil, that there will be a robust market for petroleum products in this country for the foreseeable future. That market alone justifies increased exploration, increased research, increased activity, and it will reward the companies so that these subsidies are not necessary. With that, Mr. President, I would urge rapid support and favorable support of Senator Menendez's legislation, and I would yield the floor. President, I would note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Without objection.
Mr. President, there was an article